Tale number 3 of 5 Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. 5 Tales by John Galsworthy. Tale number 3, The Apple Tree. Introductory part. From Murray's Hippolytus of Euripides, The Apple Tree, the Singing and the Gold. In their silver wedding day, Ashurst and his wife were motoring along the outskirts of the moor, intending to crown the festival by stopping the night at Torquay, where they had first met. This was the idea of Stella Ashurst, whose character contained a streak of sentiment. If she had long lost the blue-eyed, flower-like charm, the cool, slim purity of face and form, the apple blossom colouring which had so swiftly and so oddly affected Ashurst 26 years ago, she was still at 43 a comely and faithful companion, whose cheeks were faintly mottled and whose grey blue eyes had acquired a certain fullness. It was she who had stopped the car where the common rose steeply into the left, and a narrow strip of larch and beech, with here and there a pine, stretched out towards the valley between the road and the first long high hill of the full moor. She was looking for a place where they might lunch, for Ashurst never looked for anything; and this, between the golden firs and the feathery green larches smelling of lemons in the last sun of April, this, with a view into the deep valley and up to the long moor heights, seemed fitting to the decisive nature of one who sketched in water colours and loved romantic spots. Grasping her paint box, she got out. "Won't this do, Frank?" Ashurst, rather like a bearded Schiller, grey in the wings, tall, long-legged, with large remote grey eyes, which sometimes filled with meaning and became almost beautiful, with nose a little to one side, and bearded lips just open, Ashurst, 48 and silent, grasped the luncheon basket and got out too. "Oh, look, Frank, a grave!" By the side of the road, where the track from the top of the common crossed it at right angles, and ran through a gate past the narrow wood, was a thin mound of turf, 6 feet by 1, with a moorstone to the west, and on it someone had thrown a blackthorn spray and a handful of bluebells. Ashurst looked, and the poet in him moved. At crossroads, a suicide's grave. Poor mortals with their superstitions! Whoever lay there, though, had the best of it, no clammy sepulchre among other hideous graves carved with futilities, just a rough stone, the wide sky, and wayside blessings. And without comment, for he had learned not to be a philosopher in the bosom of his family, he strode away up on to the common, dropped the luncheon basket under a wall, spread a rug for his wife to sit on she would turn up from her sketching when she was hungry and took from his pocket Murray's translation of the Hippolytus. He had soon finished reading of the Cyprian and her revenge, and looked at the sky instead. And watching the white clouds so bright against the intense blue, Ashurst on his silver wedding day longed for he knew not what. Maladjusted to life, man's organism. One's mode of life might be high and scrupulous, but there was always an undercurrent of greediness, a hankering and a sense of waste. Do women have it too? Who could tell? And yet men who gave vent to their appetites for novelty, their riotous longings for new adventures, new risks, new pleasures, these suffered no doubt from the reverse side of starvation, from surfeit. No getting out of it, a maladjusted animal, civilised man. There could be no garden of his choosing, of the apple tree, the singing and the gold, in the words of that lovely Greek chorus, no achievable Elysium in life, or lasting haven of happiness for any man with a sense of beauty; nothing which could compare with the captured loveliness in a work of art, set down for ever, so that to look on it or read was always to have the same precious sense of exaltation and restful inebriety. Life no doubt had moments with the quality of beauty, of unbidden flying rapture, but the trouble was they lasted no longer than the span of a cloud's flight over the sun; impossible to keep them with you, as art caught beauty and held it fast. They were fleeting as one of the glimmering or golden visions one had of the soul in nature, glimpses of its remote and brooding spirit. Here, with the sun hot on his face, a cuckoo calling from a thorn tree, and in the air the honey savour of gorse; here, among the little fronds of the young fern, the starry blackthorn, while the bright clouds drifted by high above the hills and dreamy valleys, here and now was such a glimpse; but in a moment it would pass, as the face of Pan, which looks round the corner of a rock, vanishes at your stare. And suddenly he sat up. Surely there was something familiar about this view, this bit of common, that ribbon of road, the old wall behind him. While they were driving he had not been taking notice, never did, thinking of far places or of nothing; but now he saw. 26 years ago, just at this time of year, from the farmhouse within half a mile of this very spot, he had started for that day in Torquay whence it might be said he had never returned. And a sudden ache beset his heart. He had stumbled on just one of those past moments in his life, whose beauty and rapture he had failed to arrest, whose wings had fluttered away into the unknown. He had stumbled on a buried memory, a wild, sweet time, swiftly choked and ended. And turning on his face, he rested his chin on his hands, and stared at the short grass where the little blue milkwort was growing. End of introductory part. Parts 1 and 2, and this is what he remembered. On the 1st of May, after their last year together at college, Frank Ashurst and his friend, Robert Garton, were on a tramp. They had walked that day from Brent, intending to make Chagford, but Ashurst's football knee had given out, and according to their map they had still some 7 miles to go. They were sitting on a bank beside the road where a track crossed alongside a wood, resting the knee and talking of the universe, as young men will. Both were over 6 feet, and thin as rails. Ashurst pale, idealistic, full of absence; Garton queer, round the corner, knotted, curly, like some primeval beast. Both had a literary bent; neither wore a hat. Ashurst's hair was smooth, pale, wavy, and had a way of rising on either side of his brow, as if always being flung back. Garton's was a kind of dark, unfathomed mop. They had not met a soul for miles. "My dear fellow," Garton was saying, "pity's only an effect of self consciousness, it's a disease of the last 5,000 years. The world was happier without." Ashurst, following the clouds with his eyes, answered: "It's the pearl in the oyster, anyway." "My dear chap, all our modern unhappiness comes from pity. Look at animals, and Red Indians, limited to feeling their own occasional misfortunes. Then look at ourselves, never free from feeling the toothaches of others. Let's get back to feeling for nobody, and have a better time." "You'll never practise that." Garton pensively stirred the hotchpotch of his hair. "To attain full growth one mustn't be squeamish. To starve oneself emotionally is a mistake. All emotion is to the good enriches life." "Yes, and when it runs up against chivalry?" "Ah! That's so English. If you speak of emotion, the English always think you want something physical, and are shocked. They're afraid of passion, but not of lust. Oh, no, so long as they can keep it secret." Ashurst did not answer. He had plucked a blue floweret and was twiddling it against the sky. A cuckoo began calling from a thorn tree. The sky, the flowers, the songs of birds. Robert was talking through his hat, and he said: "Well, let's go on, and find some farm where we can put up." In uttering those words he was conscious of a girl coming down from the common just above them. She was outlined against the sky, carrying a basket, and you could see that sky through the crook in her arm. Ashurst, who saw beauty without wondering how it could advantage him, thought: 'How pretty!' The wind, blowing her dark frieze skirt against her legs, lifted her battered peacock tam o' shanter. Her greyish blouse was worn and old; her shoes were split; her little hands rough and red; her neck browned. Her dark hair waved untidy across her broad forehead; her face was short, her upper lip short, showing a glint of teeth; her brows were straight and dark, her lashes long and dark, her nose straight. But her grey eyes were the wonder, dewy as if opened for the first time that day. She looked at Ashurst; perhaps he struck her as strange, limping along without a hat, with his large eyes on her, and his hair falling back. He could not take off what was not on his head, but put up his hand in a salute and said: "Can you tell us if there's a farm near here where we could stay the night? I've gone lame." "There's only our farm near, sir." She spoke without shyness, in a pretty, soft, crisp voice. "And where is that?" "Down here, sir." "Would you put us up?" "Oh, I think we would." "Will you show us the way?" "Yes, sir." He limped on, silent, and Garton took up the catechism. "Are you a Devonshire girl?" "No, sir." "What then?" "From Wales." "Oh, I thought you were a Celt. So it's not your farm?" "My aunt's, sir." "And your uncle's?" "He is dead." "Who farms it, then?" "My aunt and my 3 cousins." "But your uncle was a Devonshire man?" "Yes, sir." "Have you lived here long?" "7 years." "How'd you like it after Wales?" "I don't know, sir." "I suppose you don't remember?" "Oh, yes; but it is different." "Oh, I believe you." Ashurst broke in suddenly: "How old are you?" "17, sir." "And what's your name?" "Megan David." "This is Robert Garton, and I am Frank Ashurst. We wanted to get on to Chagford." "It is a pity your leg is hurting you." Ashurst smiled, and when he smiled his face was rather beautiful. Descending past the narrow wood, they came on the farm suddenly, a long, low, stone built dwelling with casement windows, in a farmyard where pigs and fowls and an old mare were straying. A short, steep up grass hill behind was crowned with a few Scotch firs, and in front an old orchard of apple trees, just breaking into flower, stretching down to a stream and a long wild meadow. A little boy with oblique dark eyes was shepherding a pig, and by the house door stood a woman, who came towards them. The girl said: "It is Mrs. Narracombe, my aunt." Mrs. Narracombe, my aunt, had a quick dark eye, like a mother wild duck's, and something of the same snaky turn about her neck. "We met your niece on the road," said Ashurst. She thought you might perhaps put us up for the night." Mrs. Narracombe, taking them in from head to heel, answered: "Well, I can, if you don't mind one room. Megan, get the spare room ready, and a bowl of cream. You'll be wanting tea, I suppose." Passing through a sort of porch made by two yew trees and some flowering currant bushes, the girl disappeared into the house, her peacock tam o' shanter bright athwart that rosy pink and the dark green of the yews. "Will you come into the parlour and rest your leg? You'll be from college, perhaps?" "We were, but we've gone down now." Mrs. Narracombe nodded sagely. The parlour, brick floored, with bare table and shiny chairs and sofa stuffed with horsehair, seemed never to have been used, it was so terribly clean. Ashurst sat down at once on the sofa, holding his lame knee between his hands, and Mrs. Narracombe gazed at him. He was the only son of a late professor of chemistry, but people found a certain lordliness in one who was often so sublimely unconscious of them. "Is there a stream where we could bathe?" "There's the stream at the bottom of the orchard, but sitting down you'll not be covered." "How deep?" "Well, 'tis about 1.5 foot, maybe." "Oh! That'll be fine. Which way?" "Down the lane, through the second gate on the right, and the pool's by the big apple tree that stands by itself. There's trout there, if you can tickle them." "They're more likely to tickle us." Mrs. Narracombe smiled. "There'll be the tea ready when you come back." The pool, formed by the damming of a rock, had a sandy bottom, and the big apple tree, lowest in the orchard, grew so close that its boughs almost overhung the water. It was in leaf, and all but in flower, its crimson buds just bursting. There was not room for more than one at a time in that narrow bath, and Ashurst waited his turn, rubbing his knee, and gazing at the wild meadow, all rocks and thorn trees and feld flowers, with a grove of beeches beyond, raised up on a flat mound. Every bough was swinging in the wind, every spring bird calling, and a slanting sunlight dappled the grass. He thought of Theocritus and the river Cherwell, of the moon and the maiden with the dewy eyes, of so many things that he seemed to think of nothing, and he felt absurdly happy. During a late and sumptuous tea with eggs to it, cream and jam, and thin fresh cakes touched with saffron, Garton descanted on the Celts. It was about the period of the Celtic awakening, and the discovery that there was Celtic blood about this family had excited one who believed that he was a Celt himself. Sprawling on a horsehair chair, with a hand-made cigarette dribbling from the corner of his curly lips, he had been plunging his cold pin points of eyes into Ashurst's and praising the refinement of the Welsh. To come out of Wales into England was like the change from china to earthenware. Frank, as a damned Englishman, had not, of course, perceived the exquisite refinement and emotional capacity of that Welsh girl; and, delicately stirring in the dark mat of his still wet hair, he explained how exactly she illustrated the writings of the Welsh bard Morgan ap Something in the 12th century. Ashurst, full length on the horsehair sofa, and jutting far beyond its end, smoked a deeply coloured pipe, and did not listen, thinking of the girl's face when she brought in a relay of cakes. It had been exactly like looking at a flower, or some other pretty sight in nature, till, with a funny little shiver, she had lowered her glance and gone out, quiet as a mouse. "Let's go to the kitchen," said Garton, "and see some more of her." The kitchen was a whitewashed room with rafters, to which were attached smoked hams. There were flower pots on the window sill, and guns hanging on nails, queer mugs, china and pewter, and portraits of Queen Victoria. A long narrow table of plain wood was set with bowls and spoons, under a string of high hung onions; two sheep dogs and three cats lay there and here. On one side of the recessed fireplace sat two small boys, idle and good as gold; on the other sat a stout, light eyed, red faced youth, with hair and lashes the colour of the tow he was running through the barrel of a gun. Between them Mrs. Narracombe dreamily stirred some savoury scented stew in a large pot. Two other youths, oblique eyed, dark haired, rather sly faced, like the two little boys, were talking together and lolling against the wall; and a short, elderly, clean shaven man in corduroys, seated in the window, was conning a battered journal. The girl Megan seemed the only active creature, drawing cider and passing with the jugs from cask to table. Seeing them thus about to eat, Garton said: "Ah! If you'll just let us, we'll come back when supper's over." And without waiting for an answer, they withdrew again to the parlour. But the colour in the kitchen, the warmth, the scents, and all those faces, heightened the bleakness of their shiny room, and they resumed their seats moodily. Regular gipsy type, those boys. There was only one Saxon, the fellow cleaning the gun. That girl is a very subtle study psychologically. Ashurst's lips twitched, and Garton seemed to him an ass just then. Subtle study! She was a wild flower, a creature it did you good to look at. Study! Garton went on: "Emotionally she would be wonderful. She wants awakening. And are you going to awaken her?" Garton looked at him and smiled. "How coarse and English you are!" that curly smile seemed saying. And Ashurst puffed his pipe. Awaken her! That fool had the best opinion of himself. He threw up the window and leaned out. Dusk had gathered thick. The farm buildings and the wheel house were all dim and bluish, the apple trees but a blurred wilderness, the air smelled of wood smoke from the kitchen fire. One bird, going to bed later than the others, was uttering a half hearted twitter, as though surprised at the darkness. From the stable came the snuffle and stamp of a feeding horse. And away over there was the loom of the moor, and away the shy stars, which had not as yet full light, pricking white through the deep blue heavens. A quavering owl hooted. Ashurst drew a deep breath. What a night to wander out in! A padding of unshod hoofs came up the lane, and three dim dark shapes passed ponies on an evening march. Their heads, black and fuzzy, showed above the gate. At the tap of his pipe, and a shower of little sparks, they shied round and scampered. A bat went fluttering past, uttering its almost inaudible chip, chip. Ashurst held out his hand. On the upturned palm he could feel the dew. Suddenly from overhead he heard little burring boys' voices, little thumps of boots thrown down, and another voice, crisp and soft the girl's putting them to bed, no doubt and 9 clear words: "No, Rick, you can't have the cat in bed." Then came a skirmish of giggles and gurgles, a soft slap, a laugh so low and pretty that it made him shiver a little. A blowing sound, and the glim of the candle which was fingering the dusk above went out. Silence reigned. Ashurst withdrew to the room and sat down. His knee pained him, and his soul felt gloomy. "You go to the kitchen," he said. "I'm going to bed." End of Parts 1 and 2. Parts 3 and 4 of Tale 3 of 5 Tales by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Wales. For Ashurst, the wheel of slumber was wont to turn noiseless and slick and swift, But though he seemed sunk in sleep when his companion came up, he was really wide awake; and long after Carton, smothered in the other bed of that low roofed room, was worshipping darkness with his upturned nose, he heard the owls. Barring the discomfort of his knee, it was not unpleasant, the cares of life did not loom large in night watches for this young man. In fact, he had none; just enrolled a barrister, with literary aspirations, the world before him, no father or mother, and 400 a year of his own. Did it matter where he went, what he did, or when he did it? His bed, too, was hard, and this preserved him from fever. He lay, sniffing the scent of the night which drifted into the low room through the open casement close to his head. Except for a definite irritation with his friend, natural when you have tramped with a man for 3 days, Ashurst's memories and visions that sleepless night were kindly and wistful and exciting. One vision, specially clear and unreasonable, for he had not even been conscious of noting it, was the face of the youth cleaning the gun. Its intent, stolid, yet startled up look at the kitchen doorway quickly shifted to the girl carrying the cider jug. This red, blue eyed, light lashed, tow haired face stuck as firmly in his memory as the girl's own face, so dewy and simple. But at last, in the square of darkness, through the uncurtained casement, he saw day coming, and heard one hoarse and sleepy caw. Then followed silence, dead as ever, till the song of a blackbird not properly awake adventured into the hush. And from staring at the framed brightening light, Ashurst fell asleep. Next day his knee was badly swollen; the walking tour was obviously over. Garton, due back in London on the morrow, departed at midday with an ironical smile which left a scar of irritation, healed the moment his loping figure vanished around the corner of the steep lane. All day Ashurst rested his knee in a green painted wooden chair on the patch of grass by the yew tree porch, where the sunlight distilled the scent of stocks and gillyflowers, and a ghost of scent from the flowering currant bushes. Beatifically he smoked, dreamed, and watched. A farm in spring is all birth, young things coming out of bud and shell, and human beings watching over the process with faint excitement, feeding and tending what has been born. So still the young man sat, that a mother goose, with stately, cross footed waddle, brought her 6 yellow necked, grey backed goslings to strop their little beaks against the grass blades at his feet. Now and again Mrs. Narracombe, or the girl Megan, would come and ask if he wanted anything. He would smile and say: "Nothing, thanks. It's splendid here." Towards tea time they came out together, bearing a long poultice of some dark stuff in a bowl, and after a long and solemn scrutiny of his swollen knee, bound it on. When they were gone, he thought of the girl's soft "Oh!" of her pitying eyes, and the little wrinkle in her brow. And again he felt that unreasoning irritation against his departed friend, who had talked such rot about her. When she brought out his tea, he said: "How did you like my friend, Megan?" She forced down her upper lip, as if afraid that to smile was not polite. "He was a funny gentleman. He made us laugh. I think he's very clever." "What did he say to make you laugh?" "He said I was a daughter of the bards." "What are they?" "Welsh poets who lived hundreds of years ago." Why am I their daughter, please?" "He meant that you were the sort of girl they sang about." She wrinkled her brows. "I think he likes to joke. Am I?" "Would you believe me if I told you?" "Oh, yes." "Well, I think he was right." She smiled. And Ashurst thought: 'You are a pretty thing!' He said, too, that Joe was a Saxon type. What would that be? "Which is Joe? With the blue eyes and red face?" "Yes, my uncle's nephew." "Not your cousin, then?" "No." "Well, he meant that Joe was like the men who came over to England about 1400 years ago and conquered it." "Oh, I know about them. But is he?" "Garton's crazy about that sort of thing, but I must say Joe does look a bit early Saxon." "Yes." That "yes" tickled Ashurst. It was so crisp and graceful, so conclusive, and politely acquiescent in what was evidently Greek to her. He said that all the other boys were regular gipsies. He should not have said that. My aunt laughed, but she didn't like it, of course, and my cousins were angry. Uncle was a farmer. Farmers are not gipsies. It is wrong to hurt people." Ashurst wanted to take her hand and give it a squeeze, but he only answered: "Quite right, Megan. By the way, I heard you putting the little ones to bed last night." She flushed a little. "Please to drink your tea. It is getting cold. Shall I get you some fresh?" "Do you ever have time to do anything for yourself?" "Oh, yes." "I've been watching, but I haven't seen it yet." She wrinkled her brows in a puzzled frown, and her colour deepened. When she was gone, Ashurst thought: 'Did she think I was chaffing her? I wouldn't for the world.' He was at that age when to some men beauty's a flower, as the poet says, and inspires in them the thoughts of chivalry. Never very conscious of his surroundings, it was some time before he was aware that the youth whom Garton had called a Saxon type was standing outside the stable door; and a fine bit of colour he made in his soiled brown velvet cords, muddy gaiters, and blue shirt; red armed, red faced, the sun turning his hair from tow to flax; immovably stolid, persistent, unsmiling he stood. Then, seeing Ashurst looking at him, he crossed the yard at that gait of the young countryman always ashamed not to be slow and heavy dwelling on each leg, and disappeared round the end of the house towards the kitchen entrance. A chill came over Ashurst's mood. Clods? With all the goodwill in the world, how impossible to get on terms with them! And yet, see that girl! Her shoes were split, her hands rough, but what was it? Was it really her Celtic blood, as Garton had said? She was a lady born, a jewel, though probably she could do more than just read and write. The elderly, clean shaven man he had seen last night in the kitchen had come into the yard with a dog, driving the cows to their milking. Ashurst saw that he was lame. "You've got some good ones there." The lame man's face brightened. He had the upward look in his eyes which prolonged suffering often brings. "Yeh, them's praaper beauties. Good milkers, too." "I bet they are." "'Ope it's your legs better, sir." "Thank you, it's getting on." The lame man touched his own. "I know what 'tis myself. 'Tis a main worryin' thing, the knee. I've 'ad mine bad this 10 year." Ashurst made the sound of sympathy which comes so readily from those who have an independent income, and the lame man smiled again. "Mustn't complain, though. They mighty near had it off." "Oh!" "Yeas, an' compared with what 'twas,
'Tis almost as good as new. They put a bandage of splendid stuff on mine. The maid she picks it. She'm a good maid wi' the flowers. There's folks zeem to know the healing in these things. My mother was a rare one for that. 'Ope as you'll zune be better, zur. Go on there." Ashurst smiled. With the flowers a flower herself! That evening, after his supper of cold duck, junket, and cider, the girl came in. "Please, auntie says, will you try a piece of our May Day cake? If I may come to the kitchen for it." "Oh, yes. You'll be missing your friend." "Not I. But are you sure no one minds?" "Who would mind? We shall be very pleased." Ashurst rose too suddenly for his stiff knee, staggered, and subsided. The girl gave a little gasp, and held out her hands. Ashurst took them, small, rough, brown; checked his impulse to put them to his lips, and let her pull him up. She came close beside him, offering her shoulder; and, leaning on her, he walked across the room. That shoulder seemed quite the pleasantest thing he had ever touched. But he had presence of mind enough to catch his stick out of the rack, and withdraw his hand before arriving at the kitchen. That night he slept like a top, and woke with his knee of almost normal size. He again spent the morning in his chair on the grass patch, scribbling down verses; but in the afternoon he wandered about with the two little boys, Nick and Rick. It was Saturday, so they were early home from school. Quick, shy, dark little rascals of 7 and 6, soon talkative, for Ashurst had a way with children. By 4 o'clock they had shown him all their methods of destroying life except the tickling of trout, and with breeches tucked up lay on their stomachs over the trout stream, pretending that they had this accomplishment also. They tickled nothing, of course, for their giggling and shouting scared every spotted thing away. Ashurst, on a rock at the edge of the beech clump, watched them, and listened to the cuckoos, till Nick, the elder and less persevering, came up and stood beside him. "The gipsy bogle zets on that stone," he said. "What gipsy bogie?" "Dunno. Never zeen 'e. Megan says as 'e zets there, and old Jim zeed it once. 'E was zettin' there straight before our pony kicked in father's head. 'E plays the viddle." "What tune does he play?" "Dunno." "What's he like?" "'E's black. Old Jim says 'e's all over 'air. 'E's a praaper bogle, and done come only at night." The little boy's oblique dark eyes slid round. "D'ee think 'e might want to take me away? Megan's feared of 'e." "Has she seen him?" "No, she's not afeared o' yu." "I should think not. Why should she be?" "She says a prayer for you." "How do you know that, you little rascal?" "When I was asleep she said, 'God bless us all and Mr. Ashes.' I heard 'er whisperin' en." "You're a little ruffian to tell what you hear when you're not meant to hear it." The little boy was silent, and then he said aggressively: "I can skin rabbits. Megan she can't bear skinning 'em. I like blood." "Oh, you do, you little monster! What's that?" "A creature that likes hurting others." The little boy scowled. "Them only dead rabbits. What's us eat?" "Quite right, Nick. I beg your pardon." "I can skin frogs too." But Ashurst had become absent. God bless us all and Mr. Ashes! And puzzled by that sudden inaccessibility, Nick ran back to the stream where the giggling and shouts again rose at once. When Megan brought his tea, he said: "What's the gipsy bogle, Megan?" She looked up, startled. "He brings bad things." "Surely you don't believe in ghosts?" "I hope I will never see him." "Of course you won't.
There aren't such things. What old Jim saw was a pony." "No, there are bogies in the rocks. They are the men who lived long ago." "They aren't gipsies, anyway. Those old men were dead long before gipsies came." She said simply: "They are all bad." "Why? If there are any, they're only wild, like the rabbits. The flowers aren't bad for being wild; the thorn trees were never planted, and you don't mind them. I shall go down at night and look for your bogie, and have a talk with him." "Oh, no, no!" "Oh, yes. I shall go and sit on his rock." She clasped her hands together. "Oh, please!" "Why, what does it matter if anything happens to me?" She did not answer, and in a sort of pet he added: "Well, I dare say I shan't see him, because I suppose I must be off soon." "Soon?" "Your aunt won't want to keep me here." "Oh, yes, we always let lodgings in summer." Fixing his eyes on her face, he asked: "Would you like me to stay?" "Yes." "I'm going to say a prayer for you to night." She flushed crimson, frowned, and went out of the room. He sat cursing himself till his tea was stewed. It was as if he had hacked with his thick boots at a clump of bluebells. Why had he said such a silly thing? Was he such a towny college ass like Robert Garton, as far from understanding this girl? Ashurst spent the next week confirming the restoration of his leg, by exploration of the country within easy reach. Spring was a revelation to him this year. In a kind of intoxication he would watch the pink white buds of some backward beech tree sprayed up in the sunlight against the deep blue sky, or the trunks and limbs of the few Scotch firs, tawny in violent light, or again, on the moor, the gale bent larches which had such a look of life when the wind streamed in their young green, above the rusty black underboughs. Or he would lie on the banks, gazing at the clusters of dog violets; or up in the dead bracken fingering the pink transparent buds of the dewberry, while the cuckoos called and yafes laughed, or a lark, from very high, dripped its beads of song. It was certainly different from any spring he had ever known, for spring was within him, not without. In the daytime he hardly saw the family, and when Megan brought in his meals, she always seemed too busy in the house or among the young things in the yard to stay talking long. But in the evenings he installed himself in the window seat in the kitchen, smoking and chatting with the lame man Jim, or Mrs. Narracombe, while the girl sewed or moved about, clearing the supper things away; and sometimes, with the sensation a cat must feel when it purrs, he would become conscious that Megan's eyes, those dew grey eyes, were fixed on him with a sort of lingering, soft look which was strangely flattering. It was on Sunday week in the evening, when he was lying in the orchard listening to a blackbird and composing a love poem, that he heard the gate swing to, and saw the girl come running among the trees, with the red cheeked, stolid Joe in swift pursuit. About 20 yards away the chase ended, and the two stood fronting each other, not noticing the stranger in the grass; the boy pressing on, the girl fending him off. Ashurst could see her face, angry, disturbed. And the youth's who would have thought that red faced yokel could look so distraught? And painfully affected by the sight, he jumped up. They saw him then. Megan dropped her hands and shrank behind a tree trunk. The boy gave an angry grunt, rushed at the bank, scrambled over, and vanished. Ashurst went slowly up to her. She was standing quite still, biting her lip, very pretty, with her fine dark hair blown loose about her face, and her eyes cast down. "I beg your pardon," he said. She gave him one upward look, from eyes much dilated; then, catching her breath, turned away. Ashurst followed. "Megan " But she went on, and taking hold of her arm, he turned her gently round to him. "Stop and speak to me." "Why do you beg my pardon? It is not to me you should do that." "Well, then, to Joe." "How dare he come after me?" "In love with you, I suppose." She stamped her foot. Ashurst uttered a short laugh. "Would you like me to punch his head off?" She cried with a sudden passion: "You laugh at me! You laugh at us!" He caught hold of her hands, but she shrank back, till her passionate little face and loose dark hair were caught among the pink clusters of the apple blossom. Ashurst raised one of her imprisoned hands and put his lips to it. He felt how chivalrous he was, and superior to that clod Joe, just brushing that small rough hand with his mouth. Her shrinking ceased suddenly; she seemed to tremble towards him. A sweet warmth overtook Ashurst from top to toe. This slim maiden, so simple and fine and pretty, was pleased then at the touch of his lips. And, yielding to a swift impulse, he put his arms around her, pressed her to him, and kissed her forehead. Then he was frightened; she went so pale, closing her eyes, so that the long dark lashes lay on her pale cheeks. Her hands, too, lay inert at her sides. The touch of her breast sent a shiver through him. "Megan," he sighed out, and let her go. In the utter silence a blackbird shouted. Then the girl seized his hand, put it to her cheek, her heart, her lips, kissed it passionately, and fled away among the mossy trunks of the apple trees, till they hid her from him. Ashurst sat down on a twisted old tree growing almost along the ground, and, all throbbing and bewildered, gazed vacantly at the blossom which had crowned her hair, those pink buds with one white, open apple star. What had he done? How had he let himself be thus stampeded by beauty, pity, or just the spring? He felt curiously happy, all the same; happy and triumphant, with shivers running through his limbs, and a vague alarm. This was the beginning of what? The midges bit him, the dancing gnats tried to fly into his mouth, and all the spring around him seemed to grow more lovely and alive. The songs of the cuckoos and the blackbirds, the laughter of the yaflies, the level slanting sunlight, the apple blossom which had crowned her head. He got up from the old trunk, and strode out of the orchard, wanting space, an open sky, to get on terms with these new sensations. He made for the moor, and from an ash tree in the hedge a magpie flew out to herald him. Of man, at any age from 5 years on, who can say he has never been in love? Ashurst had loved his partners at his dancing class, loved his nursery governess, girls in school holidays, perhaps never been quite out of love, cherishing always some more or less remote admiration. But this was different, not remote at all. Quite a new sensation, terribly delightful, bringing a sense of completed manhood. To be holding in his fingers such a wild flower, to be able to put it to his lips, and feel it tremble with delight against them. What intoxication and embarrassment! What to do with it? How meet her next time? His first caress had been cool, pitiful, but the next could not be, now that, by her burning little kiss on his hand, by her pressure of it to her heart, he knew that she loved him. Some natures are coarsened by love bestowed on them; others, like Ashurst's, are swayed and drawn, warmed and softened, almost exalted, by what they feel to be a sort of miracle. And up there among the tors he was racked between the passionate desire to revel in this new sensation of spring fulfilled within him, and a vague but very real uneasiness. At one moment he gave himself up completely to his pride at having captured this pretty, trustful, dewy eyed thing; at the next he thought with factitious solemnity: "Yes, my boy, but look out what you're doing. You know what comes of it." Dusk dropped down without his noticing; dusk on the carved Assyrian looking masses of the rocks; and the voice of Nature said: "This is a new world for you." As when a man gets up at 4 o'clock and goes out into a summer morning, and beasts, birds, trees stare at him, and he feels as if all had been made new. He stayed up there for hours, till it grew cold, then groped his way down the stones and heather roots to the road, back into the lane, and came again, past the wild meadow to the orchard. There he struck a match and looked at his watch. Nearly 12! It was black and unstirring in there now, very different from the lingering, bird befriended brightness of 6 hours ago. And suddenly he saw this idol of his with the eyes of the outer world; had mental vision of Mrs. Narracombe's snake like neck turned, her quick, dark glance taking it all in, her shrewd face hardening; saw the gipsy like cousins coarsely mocking and distrustful; Joe stolid and furious; only the lame man, Jim, with the suffering eyes, seemed tolerable to his mind. And the village pub, the gossiping matrons he passed on his walks; and then his own friends, Robert Carton's smile when he went off that morning 10 days ago, so ironical and knowing. Disgusting! For a minute he literally hated this earthy, cynical world to which one belonged willy nilly. The gate where he was leaning grew grey, a sort of shimmer passed before him and spread into the bluish darkness. The moon! He could just see it over the bank behind, red, nearly round, a strange moon. And turning away, he went up the lane which smelled of the night and cow dung and young leaves. In the straw yard he could see the dark shapes of cattle, broken by the pale sickles of their horns, like so many thin moons, fallen ends up. He unlatched the farm gate stealthily. All was dark in the house. Muffling his footsteps, he gained the porch, and blotted against one of the yellow trees, looked up at Megan's window. It was open. Was she sleeping, or lying awake perhaps, disturbed, unhappy at his absence? An owl hooted while he stood there peering up, and the sound seemed to fill the whole night, so quiet was all else, save for the never ending murmur of the stream running below the orchard. The cuckoos by day, and now the owls, how wonderfully they voiced this troubled ecstasy within him! And suddenly he saw her at her window, looking out. He moved a little from the yew tree and whispered: "Megan!" She drew back, vanished, reappeared, leaning far out. He stole forward on the grass patch, hit his shin against the green painted chair, and held his breath at the sound. The pale blur of her stretched down arm and face did not stir. He moved the chair and noiselessly mounted it. By stretching up his arm he could just reach. Her hand held the huge key of the front door, and he clasped that burning hand with the cold key in it. He could just see her face, the glint of teeth between her lips, her tumbled hair. She was still dressed, poor child, sitting up for him, no doubt. Pretty Megan! Her hot, roughened fingers clung to his; her face had a strange, lost look. To have been able to reach it, even with his hand! The owl hooted, a scent of sweetbriar crept into his nostrils. Then one of the farm dogs barked. Her grasp relaxed; she shrank back. "Good night, Megan." "Good night, sir." And she was gone. With a sigh he dropped back to earth, and sitting on that chair took off his boots. Nothing for it but to creep up and go to bed. Yet for a long while he sat unmoving, his feet chilly in the dew, drunk on the memory of her lost, half smiling face and the clinging grip of her burning fingers, pressing the cold key into his hand. End of Parts 3 and 4. Parts 5 and 6 of Tale 3 of 5 Tales by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Wales. He awoke feeling as if he had eaten heavily overnight, instead of having eaten nothing; and far off, unreal, seemed yesterday's romance. Yet it was a golden morning. Full spring had burst at last. In one night the Goldie cups, as the little boys called them, seemed to have made the field their own, and from his window he could see apple blossoms covering the orchard as with a rose and white quilt. He went down almost dreading to see Megan, and yet, when not she but Mrs. Narracombe brought in his breakfast, he felt vexed and disappointed. The woman's quick eye and snaky neck seemed to have a new alacrity this morning. Had she noticed? "So you and the moon went walking last night, Mr. Ashurst. Did ye have your supper anywheres?" Ashurst shook his head. "We kept it for you, but I suppose you was too busy in your brain to think o' such a thing as that." Was she mocking him in that voice of hers, which still kept some Welsh crispness against the invading burr of the West country? If she knew! And at that moment he thought: "No, no, I'll clear out. I won't put myself in such a beastly false position." But after breakfast the longing to see Megan began and increased with every minute, together with fear lest something should have been said to her which had spoiled everything. Sinister that she had not appeared, not given him even a glimpse of her. And the love poem, whose manufacture had been so important and absorbing yesterday afternoon under the apple trees, now seemed so paltry that he tore it up and rolled it into pipe spills. What had he known of love, till she seized his hand and kissed it? And now, what did he not know? But to write of it seemed mere insipidity. He went up to his bedroom to get a book, and his heart began to beat violently, for she was in there making the bed. He stood in the doorway watching, and suddenly, with turbulent joy, he saw her stoop and kiss his pillow, just at the hollow made by his head last night. How let her know he had seen that pretty act of devotion? And yet, if she heard him stealing away, it would be even worse. She took the pillow up, holding it as if reluctant to shake out the impress of his cheek, dropped it and turned round. "Megan!" She put her hands up to her cheeks, but her eyes seemed to look right into him. He had never before realised the depth and purity and touching faithfulness in those dew bright eyes, and he stammered: "It was sweet of you to wait up for me last night." She still said nothing, and he stammered on: "I was wandering about on the moor. It was such a jolly night. And I've just come up for a book." Then the kiss he had seen her give the pillow afflicted him with sudden headiness, and he went up to her. Touching her eyes with his lips, he thought with queer excitement: 'I've done it. Yesterday all was sudden, anyhow; but now I've done it!' The girl let her forehead rest against his lips, which moved downwards till they reached hers. That first real lover's kiss, strange, wonderful, still almost innocent, in which heart did it make the most disturbance? "Come to the big apple tree to night, after they've gone to bed. Megan, promise." And she whispered back: "I promise." Then, scared at her white face, scared at everything, he let her go, and went downstairs again. Yes, he had done it now; accepted her love, declared his own. He went out to the green chair as devoid of a book as ever, and there he sat staring vacantly before him, triumphant and remorseful, while under his nose and behind his back the work of the farm went on. How long he had been sitting in that curious state of vacancy he had no notion, when he saw Joe standing a little behind him to the right. The youth had evidently come from hard work in the fields, and stood shifting his feet, breathing loudly, his face coloured like a setting sun, and his arms, below the rolled up sleeves of his blue shirt, showing the hue and furry sheen of ripe peaches. His red lips were open, his blue eyes with their flaxen lashes stared fixedly at Ashurst, who said ironically: "Well, Joe, anything I can do for you?" "Yais." "What then?" "You can go away from here. Us don't want you." Ashurst's face, never too humble, assumed its most lordly look. "Very good of you, but do you know, I prefer the others should speak for themselves." The youth moved a pace or two nearer, and the scent of his honest heat afflicted Ashurst's nostrils. "What d'you stay here for?" "Because it pleases me." "'Twon't please you when I've bashed your head in." "Indeed. When would you like to begin that?" Joe answered only with the loudness of his breathing, but his eyes looked like those of a young and angry bull. Then a sort of spasm seemed to convulse his face. "Megan don't want you." A rush of jealousy, of contempt and anger with this thick, loud breathing rustic got the better of Ashurst's self possession. He jumped up, and pushed back his chair. "You can go to the devil!" And as he said those simple words, he saw Megan in the doorway with a tiny brown spaniel puppy in her arms. She came up to him quickly. "Its eyes are blue," she said. Joe turned away. The back of his neck was literally crimson. Ashurst put his finger to the mouth of the little brown bullfrog of a creature in her arms. How cosy it looked against her! "It's fond of you already." "Ah, Megan, everything is fond of you." "What was Joe saying to you, please?" "Telling me to go away, because you didn't want me here." She stamped her foot, then looked up at Ashurst. At that adoring look he felt his nerves quiver, just as if he had seen a moth scorching its wings. "To night," he said. "Don't forget." "No." And smothering her face against the puppy's little fat brown body, she slipped back into the house. Ashurst wandered down the lane. At the gate of the wild meadow he came on the lame man and his cows. "Beautiful day, Jim." "Ah, 'tis brave weather for the grass. The ashes be later than the oaks this year. When the oak before the ash." Ashurst said idly: "Where were you standing when you saw the gipsy bogie, Jim?" "It might be under that big apple tree, as you might say." "And you really do think it was there?" The lame man answered cautiously: "I shouldn't like to say rightly that 'twas there. 'Twas in my mind as 'twas there." "What do you make of it?" The lame man lowered his voice.
"They do zay old Master, Miss Narracombe come in gipsy stock, but that's tellin'. They'm a wonderful people, you know, for claimin' their own. Maybe they knew it was goin', and knew this feller longed for company. That's what I've a thought about it."
"What was he like?"
"'E 'ad 'air all over 'is face, and goin' like this 'e was, lame as if 'e 'ad a viddle. They zay there's no such thing as bogies, but I've a seen the 'air in this dog standin' up of a dark night when I couldn't see nothin' myself."
"Was there a moon?"
"Yais, very full, near. It was only just risen, gold like, behind them trees."
"And you think a ghost means trouble, do you?" The lame man pushed his hat up; his aspiring eyes looked at Ashurst more earnestly than ever.
"'Tis not for me to zay, but 'as been so unrestin' like. There's things us don't understand, that's sartin for sure. There's people that sees things, too, and others that don't never see nothin'. Now our Joe, you might put anythin' under 'is eyes and 'e'd never see it. And them other boys, too, them rattlin' fellers. But you take and put our Megan there, where there's nothin', she'll see it, and more too, or I'm mistaken."
"She's sensitive that way."
"What's that?"
"I mean, she feels everything."
"Ah, she seemed very lovin' and 'earted."
Ashurst, who felt colour coming into his cheeks, held out his tobacco pouch. "Have a fill, Jim?"
"Thankee, sir. She's wunnin' on 'er, I think."
"I expect so," said Ashurst shortly, and folding up his pouch, walked on. Lovin' hearted! Yes, and what was he doing? What were his intentions, as they say, towards this loving hearted girl? The thought dogged him, wandering through fields bright with buttercups, where the little red calves were feeding and the swallows flying high. Yes, the oaks were before the ashes, brown gold already; every tree in different stage and hue. The cuckoos and 1,000 birds were singing. The little streams were very bright; the ancients believed in a golden age, in a garden of the Hesperides. A queen wasp settled on his sleeve. Each queen wasp killed meant 2,000 fewer wasps to thieve the apples which would grow from that blossom in the orchard. But who, with love in his heart, could kill anything on a day like this? He entered a field where a young red bull was feeding. It seemed to Ashurst that he looked like Joe. But the young bull took no notice of this visitor, a little drunk himself perhaps on the singing and the glamour of the golden pasture under his short legs. Ashurst crossed out unchallenged to the hillside above the stream. From that slope a four mounted to its crown of rocks. The ground there was covered with a mist of bluebells, and nearly a score of crab apple trees were in full bloom. He threw himself down on the grass. The change from the buttercup glory and oak golden glamour of the fields to this ethereal beauty under the grey form filled him with a sort of wonder. Nothing the same, save the sound of running water and the songs of the cuckoos. He lay there a long time, watching the sunlight wheel till the crab trees threw shadows over the bluebells, his only companions a few wild bees. He was not quite sane, thinking of that morning's kiss, and of to night under the apple tree. In such a spot as this, fauns and dryads surely lived; nymphs, white as the crab apple blossom, retired within those trees; fauns, brown as the dead bracken, with pointed ears, lay in wait for them. The cuckoos were still calling when he woke; there was the sound of running water, but the sun had couched behind the tor, the hillside was cool, and some rabbits had come out. Tonight, he thought. Just as from the earth everything was pushing up, unfolding under the soft, insistent fingers of an unseen hand, so were his heart and senses being pushed unfolded. He got up, and broke off a spray from a crabapple tree. The bulbs were like Megan, shell like, rose pink, wild and fresh; and so, too, the opening flowers, white and wild and touching. He put the spray into his coat, and all the rush of the spring within him escaped in a triumphant sigh. But the rabbits scurried away. VI It was nearly 11 that night when Ashurst put down the pocket Odyssey which for half an hour he had held in his hands without reading, and slipped through the yard down to the orchard. The moon had just risen, very golden, over the hill, and like a bright, powerful watching spirit peered down through the bars of an ash tree's half naked boughs. In among the apple trees it was still dark, and he stood making sure of his direction, feeling the rough grass with his feet. A dark mass close behind him stirred with a heavy grunting sound, and 3 large pigs settled down again close to each other, under the wall. He listened. There was no wind, but the stream's burbling, whispering chuckle had gained twice its daytime strength. One bird, he could not tell what, cried "Pip pip, pip pip," with perfect monotony. He could hear a night jar spinning very far off, an owl hooting. Ashurst moved a step or two, and again halted, aware of a dim living whiteness all around his head. On the dark unstirring trees innumerable flowers and buds, all soft and blurred, were being bewitched to life by the creeping moonlight. He had the oddest feeling of actual companionship, as if a million white moths or spirits had floated in and settled between dark sky and darker ground, and were opening and shutting their wings on a level with his eyes. On the bewildering, still, scentless beauty of that moment he almost lost memory of why he had come to the orchard. The flying glamour which had clothed the earth all day had not gone now that night had fallen, but only changed into this new form. He moved on through the thicket of stems and boughs covered with that living powdering whiteness, till he reached the big apple tree. No mistaking that, even in the dark, nearly twice the height and size of any other, and leaning out towards the open meadows and the stream. Under the thick branches he stood still again, to listen. The same sounds exactly, and a fair grunting from the sleepy pigs. He put his hands on the dry, almost warm tree trunk, whose rough mossy surface gave forth a peaty scent at his touch. Would she come? Would she? And among these quivering, haunted, moon witched trees he was seized with doubts of everything. All was unearthly here, fit for no earthly lovers; fit only for god and goddess, faun and nymph, not for him and this little country girl. Would it not be almost a relief if she did not come? But all the time he was listening, and still that unknown bird went pip pip, pip pip, and there rose the busy chatter of the little trout stream, whereon the moon was flinging glances through the bars of her tree prison. The blossom on a level with his eyes seemed to grow more living every moment, seemed with its mysterious white beauty more and more a part of his suspense. He plucked a fragment and held it close. 3 blossoms. Sacrilege to pluck fruit tree blossom, soft, sacred, young blossom, and throw it away. Then suddenly he heard the gate close, the pigs stirring again and grunting, and leaning against the trunk, he pressed his hands to its mossy sides behind him, and held his breath. She might have been a spirit threading the trees, for all the noise she made. Then he saw her quite close, her dark form part of a little tree, her white face part of its blossom. So still, and peering towards him. He whispered "Megan!" and held out his hands. She ran forward, straight to his breast. When he felt her heart beating against him, Ashurst knew to the full the sensations of chivalry and passion. Because she was not of his world, because she was so simple and young and headlong, adoring and defenceless, how could he be other than her protector in the dark? Because she was so simple, all nature and beauty, as much a part of this spring night as was the living blossom, how should he not take all that she would give him, how not fulfil the spring in her heart and his? And torn between these two emotions, he clasped her close, and kissed her hair. How long they stood there without speaking he knew not. The stream went on chattering, the owls hooting, the moon kept stealing up and growing whiter, the blossom all around them and above brightened in suspense of living beauty. Their lips had sought each other's, and they did not speak. The moment speech began, all would be unreal. Spring has no speech, nothing but rustling and whispering. Spring has so much more than speech in its unfolding flowers and leaves, and the coursing of its streams, and in its sweet restless seeking. And sometimes spring will come alive, and like a mysterious presence stand, encircling lovers with its arms, laying on them the fingers of enchantment, so that, standing lips to lips, they forget everything but just a kiss. While her heart beat against him and her lips quivered on his, Ashurst felt nothing but simple rapture. Destiny meant her for his arms. Love could not be flouted. But when their lips parted for breath, division began again at once. Only passion was now so much the stronger, and he sighed: "Oh, Megan, why did you come?" She looked up, hurt, amazed. "Sir, you asked me to." "Don't call me 'sir,' my pretty sweet." "What should I be calling you?" "Frank." "Oh, I could not. Oh, no." "But you love me, don't you?" "I could not help loving you. I want to be with you, that's all." "All." So faint that he hardly heard, she whispered: "I shall die if I can't be with you." Ashurst took a mighty breath. "Come and be with me, then." "Oh!" Intoxicated by the awe and rapture of that "Oh!" he went on, whispering: "We'll go to London. I'll show you the world. And I will take care of you, I promise, Megan. I'll never be a brute to you." If I can be with you, that is all." He stroked her hair and whispered on: "To morrow I'll go to Torquay and get some money, and get you some clothes that won't be noticed, and then we'll steal away, and when we get to London, soon perhaps, if you love me well enough, we'll be married." He could feel her hair shiver with the shake of her head. "Oh, no, I could not. I only want to be with you." Drunk on his own chivalry, Ashurst went on murmuring: "It's I who am not good enough for you. Oh, Megan, when did you begin to love me?" "When I saw you in the road, and you looked at me. The first night I loved you, but I never thought you would want me." She slipped down suddenly to her knees, trying to kiss his feet. A shiver of horror went through Ashurst. He lifted her bodily up and held her fast, too upset to speak. She whispered: "Why won't you let me?" "It's I who kiss your feet." Her smile brought tears into his eyes; the whiteness of her moonlit face so close to his, the faint pink of her opened lips, had the living, unearthly beauty of the apple blossom. And then suddenly her eyes widened and stared past him painfully. She writhed out of his arms and whispered: "Look!" Ashurst saw nothing but the brightened stream, the firs faintly gilded, the beech trees glistening, and behind them all the wide loom of the moonlit hill. Behind him came her frozen whisper: "The gipsy bogie!" "Where?" "There, by the stone, under the trees." Exasperated, he leaped the stream, and strode towards the beech clump. Prank of the moonlight nothing! In and out of the boulders and thorn trees, muttering and cursing, yet with a kind of terror, he rushed and stumbled. Absurd! Silly! Then he went back to the apple tree, but she was gone. He could hear a rustle, the grunting of the pigs, the sound of a gate closing. Instead of her, only this old apple tree. He flung his arms round the trunk. What a substitute for her soft body, the rough moss against his face! What a substitute for her soft cheek, only the scent as of the woods, a little the same! And above him, and around the blossoms, more living, more moonlit than ever, seemed to glow and breathe. End of Parts 5 and 6. Part 7 of Tale 3 of 5 Tales by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Wales. Descending from the train at Torquay station, Ashurst wandered uncertainly along the front, for he did not know this particular queen of English watering places. Having little sense of what he had on, he was quite unconscious of being remarkable among its inhabitants, and strode along in his rough Norfolk jacket, dusty boots, and battered hat, without observing that people gazed at him rather blankly. He was seeking a branch of his London bank, and having found one, found also the first obstacle to his mood. Did he know anyone in Torquay? No. In that case, if he would wire to his bank in London, they would be happy to oblige him on receipt of the reply. That suspicious breath from the matter of fact world somewhat tarnished the brightness of his visions, but he sent the telegram. Nearly opposite to the post office he saw a shop full of ladies' garments, and examined the window with strange sensations. To have to undertake the clothing of his rustic love was more than a little disturbing. He went in. A young woman came forward. She had blue eyes and a faintly puzzled forehead. Ashurst stared at her in silence. "Yes, sir." "I want a dress for a young lady." The young woman smiled. Ashurst frowned. The peculiarity of his request struck him with sudden force. The young woman added hastily: "What style would you like? Something modish?" "No, simple." "What figure would the young lady be?" "I don't know. About 2 inches shorter than you, I should say." "Could you give me her waist measurement?" Megan's waist! "Oh, anything usual." "Quite." While she was gone he stood disconsolately eyeing the models in the window. And suddenly it seemed to him incredible that Megan, his Megan, could ever be dressed save in the rough tweed skirt, coarse blouse, and tam o' shanter cap he was wont to see her in. The young woman had come back with several dresses in her arms, and Ashurst eyed her laying them against her own modish figure. There was one whose colour he liked, a dove grey, but to imagine Megan clothed in it was beyond him. The young woman went away, and brought some more. But on Ashurst there had now come a feeling of paralysis. How choose? She would want a hat too, and shoes and gloves. And suppose, when he had got them all, they commonized her, as Sunday clothes always commonized village folk? Why should she not travel as she was? Ah! But conspicuousness would matter. This was a serious elopement. And staring at the young woman, he thought: 'I wonder if she guesses, and thinks me a blackguard.' 'Do you mind putting aside that grey one for me?' he said desperately at last. 'I can't decide now. I'll come in again this afternoon.' The young woman sighed. 'Oh, certainly. It's a very tasteful costume. I don't think you'll get anything that will suit your purpose better.' 'I expect not,' Ashurst murmured, and went out. Freed again from the suspicious matter of factness of the world, he took a long breath, and went back to visions. In fancy he saw the trustful, pretty creature who was going to join her life to his, saw himself and her stealing forth at night, walking over the moor under the moon; he with his arm around her, and carrying her new garments, till in some far off wood, when dawn was coming, she would slip off her old things and put on these, and an early train at a distant station would bear them away on their honeymoon journey, till London swallowed them up, and the dreams of love came true. "Frank Ashurst, haven't seen you since Rugby, old chap." Ashurst's frown dissolved. The face, close to his own, was blue eyed, suffused with sun, one of those faces where sun from within and without join in a sort of lustre, and he answered: "Phil Halliday, by Jove!" "What are you doing here?" "Oh, nothing. Just looking round and getting some money. I'm staying on the moor." "Are you lunching anywhere? Come and lunch with us. I'm here with my young sisters. They've had measles." Hooked in by that friendly arm, Ashurst went along, up a hill, down a hill, away out of the town, while the voice of Halliday, redolent of optimism as his face was of sun, explained how in this mouldy place the only decent things were the bathing and boating, and so on; till presently they came to a crescent of houses, a little above and back from the sea, and into the centre one an hotel, and made their way. "Come up to my room and have a wash. Lunch'll be ready in a jiffy." Ashurst contemplated his visage in a looking glass. After his farmhouse bedroom, the comb and one spare shirt regime of the last fortnight, this room, littered with clothes and brushes, was a sort of Capua, and he thought: 'Queer, one doesn't realise but what he did not quite know.' When he followed Halliday into the sitting room for lunch, three faces, very fair and blue eyed, were turned suddenly at the words: "This is Frank Ashurst, my young sisters." Two were indeed young, about 11 and 10; the third was perhaps 17, tall and fair haired too, with pink and white cheeks, just touched by the sun, and eyebrows, rather darker than the hair, running a little upwards from her nose to their outer points. The voices of all three were like Halliday's, high and cheerful. They stood up straight, shook hands with a quick movement, looked at Ashurst critically, away again at once, and began to talk of what they were going to do in the afternoon. A regular Diana and attendant nymphs. After the farm, this crisp, slangy, eager talk, this cool, clean, off hand refinement, was queer at first, and then so natural that what he had come from became suddenly remote. The names of the two little ones seemed to be Sabina and Freda; of the eldest, Stella. Presently the one called Sabina turned to him and said: "I say, will you come shrimping with us? It's awfully fun." Surprised by this unexpected friendliness, Ashurst murmured: "I'm afraid I've got to get back this afternoon." "Oh! Can't you put it off?" Ashurst turned to the new speaker, Stella, shook his head, and smiled. She was very pretty. Sabina said regretfully: "You might." And then the talk switched off to caves and swimming. "Can you swim far?" "About 2 miles." "Oh! I say! How jolly!" The three pairs of blue eyes, fixed on him, made him conscious of his new importance; the sensation was agreeable. Halliday said: "I say, you simply must stop and have a bathe. You'd better stay the night." "Oh, yes, do!" But again Ashurst smiled and shook his head. Then suddenly he found himself being catechised about his physical achievements. He had rowed, it seemed, in his college boat, played in his college football team, won his college mile, and he rose from table a sort of hero. The two little girls insisted that he must see their cave, and they set forth chattering like magpies, Ashurst between them, Stella and her brother a little behind. In the cave, damp and darkish like any other cave, the great feature was a pool with possibility of creature which might be caught and put into bottles. Sabina and Freda, who wore no stockings on their shapely brown legs, exhorted Ashurst to join them in the middle of it, and help sieve the water. He too was soon bootless and sockless. Time goes fast for one who has a sense of beauty, when there are pretty children in a pool, and a young Diana on the edge, to receive with wonder anything you can catch. Ashurst never had much sense of time. It was a shock when, pulling out his watch, he saw it was well past 3. No cashing his cheque to day; the bank would be closed before he could get there. Watching his expression, the little girls cried out at once: "Hurrah! Now you'll have to stay!" Ashurst did not answer. He was seeing again Megan's face, when at breakfast time he had whispered: "I'm going to Torquay, darling, to get everything. I shall be back this evening. If it's fine, we can go to night. Be ready." He was seeing again how she quivered and hung on his words. What would she think? Then he pulled himself together, conscious suddenly of the calm scrutiny of this other young girl, so tall and fair and Diana like, at the edge of the pool, of her wondering blue eyes under those brows which slanted up a little. If they knew what was in his mind, if they knew that this very night he had meant well, there would be a little sound of disgust, and he would be alone in the cave. And with a curious mixture of anger, chagrin, and shame, he put his watch back into his pocket, and said abruptly: "Oh, yes, I'm dished for to day." "Hurrah! Now you can bathe with us." It was impossible not to succumb a little to the contentment of those pretty children, to the smile on Stella's lips, to Halliday's "Ripping, old chap! I can lend you things for the night." But again a spasm of longing and remorse throbbed through Ashurst, and he said moodily: "I must send a wire." The attractions of the pool palling, they went back to the hotel. Ashurst sent his wire, addressing it to Mrs. Narracombe: "Sorry, detained for the night, back to morrow." Surely Megan would understand that he had too much to do, and his heart grew lighter. It was a lovely afternoon, warm, the sea calm and blue, and swimming his great passion. The favour of these pretty children flattered him, the pleasure of looking at them, at Stella, at Halliday's sunny face; the slight unreality, yet extreme naturalness of it all, as of a last peep at normality before he took this plunge with Megan. He got his borrowed bathing dress, and they all set forth. Halliday and he undressed behind one rock, the three girls behind another. He was first into the sea, and at once swam out with the bravado of justifying his self given reputation. When he turned he could see Halliday swimming along shore, and the girls flopping and dipping and riding the little waves, in the way he was accustomed to despise, but now thought pretty and sensible, since it gave him the distinction of the only deep water fish. But drawing near, he wondered if they would like him, a stranger, to come into their splashing group. He felt shy, approaching that slim nymph. Then Sabina summoned him to teach her to float, and between them the little girls kept him so busy that he had no time even to notice whether Stella was accustomed to his presence, till suddenly he heard a startled sound from her. She was standing submerged to the waist, leaning a little forward, her slim white arms stretched out, and pointing, her wet face puckered by the sun and an expression of fear. "Look at Phil! Is he all right? Oh, look!" Ashurst saw at once that Phil was not all right. He was splashing and struggling out of his depth, perhaps 100 yards away. Suddenly he gave a cry, threw up his arms, and went down. Ashurst saw the girl launch herself towards him and crying out: "Go back, Stella, go back!" and he dashed out. He had never swum so fast, and reached Halliday just as he was coming up a second time. It was a case of cramp, but to get him in was not difficult, for he did not struggle. The girl, who had stopped where Ashurst told her to, helped as soon as he was in his depth, and once on the beach they sat down one on each side of him to rub his limbs, while the little ones stood by with scared faces. Halliday was soon smiling. It was, he said, rotten of him, absolutely rotten. If Frank would give him an arm, he could get to his clothes all right now. Ashurst gave him the arm, and as he did so caught sight of Stella's face, wet and flushed and tearful, all broken up out of its calm, and he thought: 'I called her Stella. Wonder if she minded?' While they were dressing, Halliday said quietly: "You saved my life, old chap." "Rot!" Clothed, but not quite in their right minds, they went up all together to the hotel and sat down to tea, except Halliday, who was lying down in his room. After some slices of bread and jam, Sabina said: "I say, you know, you are a brick!" And Freda chimed in: "Rather!" Ashurst saw Stella looking down. He got up in confusion and went to the window. From there he heard Sabina mutter: "I say, let's swear blood bond. Where's your knife, Freda?" And out of the corner of his eye could see each of them solemnly prick herself, squeeze out a drop of blood, and dabble a bit of paper. He turned and made for the door. "Don't be a stoat! Come back!" His arms were seized. Imprisoned between the little girls, he was brought back to the table. On it lay a piece of paper with an effigy drawn in blood, and the 3 names: Stella Halliday, Sabina Halliday, Freda Halliday, also in blood, running towards it like the rays of a star. Sabina said: "That's you. We shall have to kiss you, you know." And Freda echoed: "Oh, blow, yes!" Before Ashurst could escape, some wettish hair dangled against his face, something like a bite descended on his nose, he felt his left arm pinched, and other teeth softly searching his cheek. Then he was released, and Freda said: "Now, Stella." Ashurst, red and rigid, looked across the table at a red and rigid Stella. Sabina giggled. Freda cried: "Buck up! It spoils everything." A queer, ashamed eagerness shot through Ashurst. Then he said quietly: "Oh, shut up, you little demons!" Again Sabina giggled. "Well, then, she can kiss her hand, and you can put it against your nose. It is on one side." To his amazement the girl did kiss her hand and stretch it out. Solemnly he took that cool, slim hand and laid it to his cheek. The two little girls broke into clapping, and Freda said: "Now then, we shall have to save your life at any time. That's settled. Can I have another cup, Stella? Not so beastly weak." Tea was resumed, and Ashurst, folding up the paper, put it in his pocket. The talk turned on the advantages of measles, tangerine oranges, honey in a spoon, no lessons, and so forth. Ashurst listened, silent, exchanging friendly looks with Stella, whose face was again of its normal sun touched pink and white. It was soothing to be so taken to the heart of this jolly family, fascinating to watch their faces. And after tea, while the two girls pressed seaward, he talked to Stella in the window seat, and looked at her water colour sketches. The whole thing was like a pleasurable dream, time and incident hung up, importance and reality suspended. To morrow he would go back to Megan, with nothing of all this left save the paper with the blood of these children in his pocket. Children! Stella was not quite that as old as Megan. Her talk, quick, rather hard and shy, yet friendly, seemed to flourish on his silences, and about her there was something cool and virginal, a maiden in a bower. At dinner, to which Halliday, who had swallowed too much sea water, did not come, Sabina said: "I'm going to call you Frank." Freda echoed: "Frank, Frank, Franky!" Ashurst grinned and bowed. "Every time Stella calls you Mr. Ashurst she's got to pay a forfeit. It's ridiculous." Ashurst looked at Stella, who grew slowly red. Sabina giggled. Freda cried: "She's smoking! Smoking! Yay!" Ashurst reached out to right and left, and grasped some fair hair in each hand. "Look here," he said, "you two. Leave Stella alone, or I'll tie you together." Freda gurgled. "Ouch! You are a beast!" Sabina murmured cautiously: "You call her Stella, you see." "Why shouldn't I? It's a jolly name." "All right. We give you leave to." Ashurst released the hair. Stella! What would she call him, after this? But she called him nothing, till at bedtime he said deliberately: "Good night, Stella." "Good night, Mr. Good night, Frank. It was jolly of you, you know." "Oh, that! Bosh!" Her quick, straight handshake tightened suddenly, and as suddenly became slack. Ashurst stood motionless in the empty sitting room. Only last night, under the apple tree and the living blossom, he had held Megan to him, kissing her eyes and lips. And he gasped, swept by that rush of remembrance. To night it should have begun his life with her who only wanted to be with him. And now 24 hours and more must pass because of not looking at his watch. Why had he made friends with this family of innocence, just when he was saying good bye to innocence and all the rest of it? "But I mean to marry her," he thought. "I told her so." He took a candle, lighted it, and went to his bedroom, which was next to Halliday's. His friend's voice called, as he was passing: "Is that you, old chap? I say, come in." He was sitting up in bed, smoking a pipe and reading. "Sit down a bit." Ashurst sat down by the open window. "I've been thinking about this afternoon, you know," said Halliday rather suddenly. "They say you go through all your past. I didn't. I suppose I wasn't far enough gone." "What did you think of?" Halliday was silent for a little, then said quietly: "Well, I did think of one thing rather odd of a girl at Cambridge that I might have you know. I was glad I hadn't got her on my mind. Anyhow, old chap, I owe it to you that I'm here. I should have been in the big dark by now. No more bed, or baccy, no more anything. I say, what do you suppose happens to us?" Ashurst murmured: "Go out like flames, I expect." "Phew! We may flicker, and cling about a bit, perhaps." "I think that's rather gloomy. I say, I hope my young sisters have been decent to you. Awfully decent." Halliday took his pipe down, crossed his hands behind his neck, and turned his face towards the window. "They're not bad kids," he said. Watching his friend lying there, with that smile, and the candlelight on his face, Ashurst shuddered. Quite true. He might have been lying there, with no smile, with all that sunny look gone out for ever. He might not have been lying there at all, but sanded at the bottom of the sea, waiting for resurrection on the 9th day, was it? And that smile of Halliday's seemed to him suddenly something wonderful, as if in it were all the difference between life and death, the little flame, the all. He got up and said softly: "Well, you ought to sleep, I expect. Shall I blow out?" Halliday caught his hand. "I can't say it, you know, but it must be rotten to be dead. Good night, old boy." Stirred and moved, Ashurst squeezed the hand and went downstairs. The hall door was still open, and he passed out on to the lawn before the crescent. The stars were bright in a very dark blue sky, and by their light some lilacs had that mysterious colour of flowers by night which no one can describe. Ashurst pressed his face against a spray, and before his closed eyes Megan started up, with the tiny brown spaniel pup against her breast. "I thought of a girl that I might have you know. I was glad I hadn't got her on my mind." He jerked his head away from the lilac and began pacing up and down over the grass, a grey phantom coming to substance, for a moment, in the light from the lamp at either end. He was with her again under the living, breathing whiteness of the blossom, the stream chattering by, the moon glinting steel blue on the bathing pool. Back in the rapture of his kisses on her upturned face of innocence and humble passion, back in the suspense and beauty of that pagan night. He stood still once more in the shadow of the lilacs. Here the sea, not the stream, was Night's voice. The sea with its sigh and rustle; no little bird, no owl, no night jar calling or spun; but a piano tinkled, and the white houses cut the sky with solid curve, and the scent from the lilacs filled the air. A window of the hotel, high up, was lighted. He saw a shadow move across the blind, and most queer sensations stirred within him, a sort of churning and twining and turning of a single emotion on itself, as though spring and love, bewildered and confused, seeking the way, were baffled. This girl, who had called him Frank, whose hand had given his that sudden little clutch, this girl so cool and pure, what would she think of such wild, unlawful loving? He sank down on the grass, sitting there cross legged, with his back to the house, motionless as some carved Buddha. Was he really going to break through innocence and steal? Sniff the scent out of a wild flower and perhaps throw it away? "Of a girl at Cambridge that I might have you know." He put his hands to the grass, one on each side, palms downwards, and pressed. It was just warm still, the grass, barely moist, soft and firm and friendly. "What am I going to do?" he thought. Perhaps Megan was at her window, looking out at the blossom, thinking of him. Poor little Megan! 'Why not?' he thought. 'I love her. But do I really love her, or do I only want her because she is so pretty and loves me? What am I going to do?' The piano tinkled on, the stars winked, and Ashurst gazed out before him at the dark sea as if spellbound. He got up at last, cramped and rather chilly; there was no longer light in any window, and he went in to bed. Out of a deep and dreamless sleep he was awakened by the sound of thumping on the door. A shrill voice called: "Hey, breakfast ready!" He jumped up. Where was he? Ah! He found them already eating marmalade, and sat down in the empty place between Stella and Sabina, who, after watching him a little, said: "I say, do buck up. We're going to start at 9:30. We're going to Berryhead, old chap. You must come." Ashurst thought: 'Come? Impossible! I shall be getting things and going back.' He looked at Stella, and she said quickly: "Do come!" Sabina chimed in: "It'll be no fun without you." Freda got up and stood behind his chair. "You've got to come, or else I'll pull your hair." Ashurst thought: 'Well, one day more to think it over one day more.' And he said: "All right, you needn't tweak my mane." "Hurrah!" At the station he wrote a second telegram to the farm, and then tore it up. He could not have explained why. From Brixham they drove in a very little wagonette. There, squeezed between Sabina and Freda, with his knees touching Stella's, they played "Up, Jenkins," and the gloom he was feeling gave way to frolic. In this one day more to think it over, he did not want to think. They ran races, wrestled, paddled; for to day nobody wanted to bathe. They sang catches, played games, and ate all they brought. The little girls fell asleep against him on the way back, and his knees still touched Stella's in the narrow wagonette. It seemed incredible that 30 hours ago he had never set eyes on any of those three flaxen heads. In the train he talked to Stella of poetry, discovering her favourites, and telling her his own with a pleasing sense of superiority, till suddenly she said, rather low: "Phil says you don't believe in a future life, Frank. I think that's dreadful." Disconcerted, Ashurst muttered: "I don't either believe or not believe. I simply don't know." She said quickly: "I couldn't bear that. What would be the use of living?" Watching the frown of those pretty oblique brows, Ashurst answered: "I don't believe in believing things because one wants to." "But why should one wish to live again, if one isn't going to?" And she looked full at him. He did not want to hurt her, but an itch to dominate pushed him on to say: "While one's alive, one naturally wants to go on living for ever. That's part of being alive. But it probably isn't anything more." "Don't you believe in the Bible at all, then?" Ashurst thought: 'Now I shall really hurt her. I believe in the Sermon on the Mount, because it's beautiful and good for all time. But don't you believe Christ was divine?" He shook his head. She turned her face quickly to the window, and there sprang into his mind Megan's prayer, repeated by little Nick: "God bless us all and Mr. Ashes." Who else would ever say a prayer for him like her who at this moment must be waiting to see him come down the lane? And he thought suddenly: 'What a scoundrel I am!' All that evening this thought kept coming back, but, as is not unusual, each time with less poignancy, till it seemed almost a matter of course to be a scoundrel. And, strange, he did not know whether he was a scoundrel if he meant to go back to Megan, or if he did not mean to go back to her. They played cards till the children were sent off to bed; then Stella went to the piano. From over on the window seat, where it was nearly dark, Ashurst watched her between the candles, that fair head on the long white neck bending to the movement of her hands. She played fluently, without much expression, but what a picture she made, the faint golden radiance, a sort of angelic atmosphere hovering about her. Who could have passionate thoughts or wild desires in the presence of that swaying white clothed girl with the seraphic head? She played a thing of Schumann's called Warum. Then Halliday brought out a flute, and the spell was broken. After this they made Ashurst sing, Stella playing him accompaniments from a book of Schumann songs, till in the middle of Ich grolle nicht two small figures clad in blue dressing gowns crept in and tried to conceal themselves beneath the piano. The evening broke up in confusion, and what Sabina called "a splendid rag." That night Ashurst hardly slept at all. He was thinking, tossing and turning. The intense domestic intimacy of these last 2 days, the strength of this Halliday atmosphere, seemed to ring him round, and make the farm and Megan, even Megan, seem unreal. Had he really made love to her, really promised to take her away to live with him? He must have been bewitched by the spring, the night, the apple blossom. This May madness could but destroy them both. The notion that he was going to make her his mistress, that simple child not yet 18, now filled him with a sort of horror, even while it still stung and whipped his blood. He muttered to himself: "It's awful what I've done awful!" And the sound of Schumann's music throbbed and mingled with his fevered thoughts, and he saw again Stella's cool, white, fair haired figure and bending neck, the queer, angelic radiance about her. "I must be mad," he thought. "What came into me? Poor little Megan! God bless us all, and Mr. Ashes. I want to be with you, only to be with you." And burying his face in his pillow, he smothered down a fit of sobbing. Not to go back was awful; to go back more awful still. Emotion, when you are young, and give real vent to it, loses its power of torture. And he fell asleep thinking: what was it? A few kisses all forgotten in a month. Next morning he got his cheque cashed, but avoided the shop of the dove grey dress like the plague, and instead bought himself some necessaries. He spent the whole day in a queer mood, cherishing a kind of sullenness against himself. Instead of the hankering of the last 2 days, he felt nothing but a blank, all passionate longing gone, as if quenched in that outburst of tears. After tea, Stella put a book down beside him and said shyly: "Have you read that, Frank?" It was Farrar's Life of Christ. Ashurst smiled. Her anxiety about his belief seemed to him comic, but touching; infectious too, perhaps, for he began to have an itch to justify himself, if not to convert her. And in the evening, when the children and Halliday were mending their shrimping nets, he said: "At the back of orthodox religion, so far as I can see, there's always the idea of reward, what you can get for being good, a kind of begging for favours. I think it all starts in fear." She was sitting on the sofa making reefer knots with a bit of string. She looked up quickly. "I think it's much deeper than that." Ashurst felt again that wish to dominate. "You think so?" he said. "But wanting the quid pro quo is about the deepest thing in all of us. It's jolly hard to get to the bottom of it." She wrinkled her brows in a puzzled frown. "I don't think I understand." He went on obstinately: "Well, think, and see if the most religious people aren't those who feel that this life doesn't give them all they want. I believe in being good because to be good is good in itself." "Then you do believe in being good?" How pretty she looked now! It was easy to be good with her. And he nodded and said: "I say, show me how to make that knot." With her fingers touching his, in manoeuvring the bit of string, he felt soothed and happy. And when he went to bed he wilfully kept his thoughts on her, wrapping himself in her fair, cool, sisterly radiance, as in some garment of protection. Next day he found they had arranged to go by train to Totnes and picnic at Berry Pomeroy Castle. Still in that resolute oblivion of the past, he took his place with them in the landau beside Halliday, back to the horses. And then, along the sea front, nearly at the turning to the railway station, his heart almost leaped into his mouth. Megan! Megan herself was walking on the far pathway, in her old skirt and jacket and her tam o' shanter, looking up into the faces of the passers by. Instinctively he threw his hand up for cover, then made a feint of clearing dust out of his eyes; but between his fingers he could see her still, moving, not with her free country step, but wavering, lost looking, pitiful, like some little dog that has missed its master and does not know whether to run on, to run back, where to run. How had she come like this? What excuse had she found to get away? What did she hope for? But with every turn of the wheels bearing him away from her, his heart revolted and cried to him to stop them, to get out, and to go to her. When the landau turned the corner to the station he could stand it no more, and opening the carriage door muttered: "I've forgotten something. Go on, don't wait for me. I'll join you at the castle by the next train." He jumped, stumbled, spun round, recovered his balance, and walked forward, while the carriage with the astonished Hallidays rolled on. From the corner he could only just see Megan, a long way ahead now. He ran a few steps, checked himself, and dropped into a walk. With each step nearer to her, further from the Hallidays, he walked more and more slowly. How did it alter anything, this sight of her? How make the going to her, and that which must come of it, less ugly? For there was no hiding it, since he had met the Hallidays he had become gradually sure that he would not marry Megan. It would only be a wild love time, a troubled, remorseful, difficult time, and then well, then he would get tired, just because she gave him everything, was so simple and so trustful, so dewy; and dew wears off. The little spot of faded colour, her tam o' shanter cap, wavered on far in front of him. She was looking up into every face, and at the house windows. Had any man ever such a cruel moment to go through? Whatever he did, he felt he would be a beast. And he uttered a groan, which made a nursemaid turn and stare. He saw Megan stop and lean against the sea wall, looking at the sea, and he too stopped. Quite likely she had never seen the sea before, and even in her distress could not resist that sight. Yes, she's seen nothing, he thought. Everything's before her, and just for a few weeks' passion I shall be cutting her life to ribbons. I'd better go and hang myself rather than do that. And suddenly he seemed to see Stella's calm eyes looking into his, the wave of fluffy hair on her forehead stirred by the wind. Ah! It would be madness, would mean giving up all that he respected, and his own self respect. he turned and walked quickly back towards the station. But memory of that poor bewildered little figure, those anxious eyes searching the passers by, smote him too hard again, and once more he turned towards the sea. The cap was no longer visible; that little spot of colour had vanished in the stream of the noon promenaders. And impelled by the passion of longing, the dearth which comes on one when life seems to be whirling something out of reach, he hurried forward. She was nowhere to be seen. For half an hour he looked for her, then on the beach flung himself face downward in the sand. To find her again he knew he had only to go to the station and wait till she returned from her fruitless quest, to take her train home; or to take train himself and go back to the farm, so that she found him there when she returned. But he lay inert in the sand, among the indifferent groups of children with their spades and buckets. Pity at her little figure wandering, seeking, was well nigh merged in the spring running of his blood, for it was all wild feeling now, the chivalrous part, what there had been of it, was gone. He wanted her again, wanted her kisses, her soft little body, her abandonment, all her quick warm pagan emotion, wanted the wonderful feeling of that night under the moonlit apple boughs, wanted it all with a horrible intensity, as the faun wants the nymph. The quick chatter of the little bright trout stream, the dazzle of the buttercups, the rocks of the old wild men, the calling of the cuckoos and yaffles, the hooting of the owls, and the red moon peeping out of the velvet dark at the living whiteness of the blossom, and her face just out of reach at the window, lost in its love look, and her heart against his, her lips answering his, under the apple tree, all this besieged him. Yet he lay inert. What was it which struggled against pity and this feverish longing, and kept him there paralysed in the warm sand? 3 flaxen heads, a fair face with friendly blue grey eyes, a slim hand pressing his, a quick voice speaking his name. So you believe in being good? Yes, and a sort of atmosphere as of some old walled in English garden, with pinks and cornflowers and roses, and scents of lavender and lilacool, and fair, untouched, almost holy. All that he had been brought up to feel was clean and good. And suddenly he thought: 'She might come along the front again and see me,' and he got up and made his way to the rock at the far end of the beach. There, with the spray biting into his face, he could think more coolly. To go back to the farm and love Megan out in the woods, among the rocks, with everything around wild and fitting, that he knew was impossible, utterly. To transplant her to a great town, to keep in some little flat or rooms one who belonged so wholly to nature, the poet in him shrank from it. His passion would be a mere sensuous revel, soon gone. In London, her very simplicity, her lack of all intellectual quality, would make her his secret plaything, nothing else. The longer he sat on the rock, with his feet dangling over a greenish pool from which the sea was ebbing, the more clearly he saw this. But it was as if her arms and all of her were slipping slowly, slowly down from him into the pool, to be carried away to the sea; and her face looking up, her lost face with beseeching eyes and dark, wet hair, possessed, haunted, tortured him. He got up at last, scaled the low rock cliff, and made his way down into a sheltered cove. Perhaps in the sea he could get back his control, and lose this fever. And stripping off his clothes, he swam out. He wanted to tire himself so that nothing mattered, and swam recklessly, fast and far. Then, suddenly, for no reason, felt afraid. Suppose he could not reach shore again; suppose the current set him out, or he got a cramp, like Halliday. He turned to swim in. The red cliffs looked a long way off. If he were drowned, they would find his clothes. The Hallidays would know, but Megan perhaps never. They took no newspaper at the farm. And Phil Halliday's words came back to him again: "A girl at Cambridge I might have glad I haven't got her on my mind." And in that moment of unreasoning fear he vowed he would not have her on his mind. Then his fear left him; he swam in easily enough, dried himself in the sun, and put on his clothes. His heart felt sore, but no longer ached, his body cool and refreshed. When one is as young as Ashurst, pity is not a violent emotion. And back in the Halliday sitting room, eating a ravenous tea, he felt much like a man recovered from fever. Everything seemed new and clear; the tea, the buttered toast and jam tasted absurdly good; tobacco had never smelt so nice. And walking up and down the empty room, he stopped here and there to touch or look. He took up Stella's work basket, fingered the cotton reels and a gaily coloured plait of sewing silks, smelt at the little bag filled with woodroffe she kept among them. He sat down at the piano, playing tunes with one finger, thinking: 'To night she'll play. I shall watch her while she's playing. It does me good to watch her.' He took up the book, which still lay where she had placed it beside him, and tried to read. But Megan's little sad figure began to come back at once, and he got up and leaned in the window, listening to the thrushes in the crescent gardens, gazing at the sea, dreamy and blue below the trees. A servant came in and cleared the tea away, and he still stood, inhaling the evening air, trying not to think. Then he saw the Hallidays coming through the gate of the crescent; Stella a little in front of Phil, and the children with their baskets, and instinctively he drew back. His heart, too sore and discomfited, shrank from this encounter, yet wanted its friendly solace; bore a grudge against this influence, yet craved its cool innocence and the pleasure of watching Stella's face. From against the wall behind the piano he saw her come in, and stand looking a little blank as though disappointed. Then she saw him and smiled, a swift brilliant smile, which warmed yet irritated Ashurst. "You never came after us, Frank." "No, I found I couldn't." "Look, we picked such lovely late violets." She held out a bunch. Ashurst put his nose to them, and there stirred within him vague longings, chilled instantly by a vision of Megan's anxious face lifted to the faces of the passers by. He said shortly: "How jolly!" and turned away. He went up to his room, and avoiding the children who were coming up the stairs, threw himself on his bed and lay there with his arms crossed over his face. Now that he felt the die really cast, and Megan given up, he hated himself, and almost hated the Hallidays and their atmosphere of healthy, happy English homes. Why should they have chanced here to drive away first love, to show him that he was going to be no better than a common seducer? What right had Stella, with her fair, shy beauty, to make him know for certain that he would never marry Megan, and, tarnishing it all, bring him such bitterness of regretful longing, and such pity? Megan would be back by now, worn out by her miserable seeking, poor little thing, expecting, perhaps, to find him there when she reached home. Ashurst bit at his sleeve to stifle a groan of remorseful longing. He went to dinner glum and silent, and his mood threw a dinge even over the children. It was a melancholy, rather ill tempered evening, for they were all tired. Several times he caught Stella looking at him with a hurt, puzzled expression, and this pleased his evil mood. He slept miserably, got up quite early, and wandered out. He went down to the beach. Alone there with the serene, the blue, the sunlit sea, his heart relaxed a little. Conceited fool, to think that Megan would take it so hard; in a week or two she would almost have forgotten. And he well, he would have the reward of virtue. A good young man! If Stella knew, she would give him her blessing for resisting that devil she believed in; and he uttered a hard laugh. But slowly the peace and beauty of sea and sky, the flight of the lonely sea gulls, made him feel ashamed. He bathed, and turned homewards. In the Crescent Gardens Stella herself was sitting on a camp stool sketching. He stole up close behind. How fair and pretty she was, bent diligently, holding up her brush, measuring, wrinkling her brows. He said gently: "Sorry I was such a beast last night, Stella." She turned round startled, flushed very pink, and said in her quick way: "It's all right. I knew there was something. Between friends it doesn't matter, does it?" Ashurst answered: "Between friends. And we aren't we?" She looked up at him and nodded vehemently, and her upper teeth gleamed again in that swift, brilliant smile. 3 days later he went back to London, travelling with the Hallidays. He had not written to the farm. What was there he could say? On the last day of April in the following year he and Stella were married. Such were Ashurst's memories, sitting against the wall among the gorse, on his silver wedding day. At this very spot, where he had laid out the lunch, Megan must have stood outlined against the sky when he had first caught sight of her. Of all queer coincidences! And there moved in him a longing to go down and see again the farm and the orchard and the meadow of the gipsy bogle. It would not take long; Stella would be an hour yet, perhaps. How well he remembered it all, the little crowning group of pine trees, the steep up grass hill behind. He paused at the farm gate. The low stone house, the yew tree porch, the flowering currants not changed a bit. Even the old green chair was out there on the grass under the window, where he had reached up to her that night to take the key. Then he turned down the lane, and stood leaning on the orchard gate, grey skeleton of a gate, as then. A black pig even was wandering in there among the trees. Was it true that 26 years had passed, or had he dreamed and wakened to find Megan waiting for him by the big apple tree? Unconsciously he put up his hand to his grizzled beard, and brought himself back to reality. Opening the gate, he made his way down through the docks and nettles till he came to the edge, and the old apple tree itself. Unchanged! A little more of the grey green lichen, a little dead branch or two, and for the rest it might have been only last night that he had embraced that mossy trunk after Megan's flight, and inhaled its woody savour, while above his head the moonlight blossom had seemed to breathe and live. In that early spring a few buds were showing already, the blackbirds shouting their songs, a cuckoo calling, the sunlight bright and warm. Incredibly, the same, the chattering trout stream, the narrow pool he had lain in every morning, splashing the water over his flanks and chest; and out there in the wild meadow the beech clump and the stone where the gipsy bogle was supposed to sit; and an ache for lost youth, a hankering, a sense of wasted love and sweetness gripped Ashurst by the throat. Surely on this earth of such wild beauty one was meant to hold rapture to one's heart, as this earth and sky held it. And yet one could not. He went to the edge of the stream, and looking down at the little pool, thought: 'Youth and spring what has become of them all, I wonder?' And then, in a sudden fear of having this memory jarred by human encounter, he went back to the lane, and pensively retraced his steps to the cross roads. Beside the car, an old grey bearded labourer was leaning on a stick, talking to the chauffeur. He broke off at once, as though guilty of disrespect, and touching his hat, prepared to limp on down the lane. Ashurst pointed to the narrow green mound. "Can you tell me what this is?" The old fellow stopped. On his face had come a look as though he were thinking: "You've come to the right shop, mister." "'Tis a grave," he said. "But why out here?" The old man smiled. "That's a tale, as you may say, and not the first time as I've a told it. There's plenty folks asks about that bit of turf. Maid's grave, us calls it, hereabouts." Ashurst held out his pouch. "Have a fill?" The old man touched his hat again, and slowly filled an old clay pipe. His eyes, looking upward out of a mass of wrinkles and hair, were still quite bright. "If yu don't mind, zur, I'd set down my leg's hurtin' a bit to day," and he sat down on the mound of turf. "There's always a flower on this grave, and 'tain't so very lonesome neither, brave, not a lot of folks goes by now, in they new motor cars and things, not as 'twas in the old days. She've a got company up here. 'Twas a poor soul killed herself." "I see," said Ashurst. "Cross roads burial. I didn't know that custom was kept up." "Ah, but 'twas a main long time ago. Us had a parson as was very God fearin' then. Let me see, I've had my pension 6 year come Michaelmas, and I was were just on 50 when it happened. There's none livin' knows more about it than I du. She belonged close here, same farm as where I used to work along o' Mrs. Narracombe. 'Tis Nick Narracombe's now. I does a bit for 'em still, odd times." Ashurst, who was leaning against the gate, lighting his pipe, left his curved hands before his face for long after the flame of the match had gone out. "Yes," he said, and to himself his voice sounded hoarse and queer. "She was one in an 100, poor maid. I puts a flower 'ere every time I passes. Pretty maid and good maid she was, though they don't bury 'em up to the church, nor where she wanted to be buried neither." The old labourer paused and put his hairy twisted hand flat down on the turf beside the bluebells. "Yes?" said Ashurst. "In a manner of speakin'," the old man went on, "I think as 'twas a love story, though there's no one never knew for sartin. You can't tell what's in a maid's head, but that's what I think about it." He drew his hand across the turf. "I was fond of that maid. Don't know as there was anyone as wasn't fond of her. But she was so lovin' hearted that's where 'twas, I think." He looked up, and Ashurst, whose lips were trembling in the cover of his beard, murmured again: "Yes?" "'Twas in the spring, 'bout now as I might be, or a little later, blossom time, and we had one o' they young college gentlemen staying in the farm. Nice feller too, with 'is head in the air. I liked 'e very well, and I never see nothin' between 'em, but to my thinkin' 'e turned the maid's fancy." The old man took the pipe out of his mouth, spat, and went on: "You see, 'e went away sudden one day and never come back.
They got his knapsack and bits of things down there still. That's what stuck in my mind, 'is never sending for 'em. His name was Ashes, or something like that." "Yes?" said Ashurst once more. The old man licked his lips. "'Er never said nothin', but from that day 'er went kind o' dazed lookin'. Didn't seem likely there at all. I never knew a human creature so changed in my life never. There was another young feller at the farm, Joe Biddeford 'is name were, as was properly sweet on her too. I guess he's used to plague her and with his attention. She got to look quite wild. I'd see her sometimes of an evenin', when I was bringin' up the calves. There she'd stand in the orchard under the big apple tree, lookin' straight before her. Well, I used to think, 'Dunno what's the matter with you, but you're lookin' pitiful, that you be.'" The old man relit his pipe and sucked at it reflectively. "Yes?" said Ashurst. "I remembers one day I said to her: 'What's the matter, Megan?' Her name was Megan David. She come from Wales, same as her aunt, old Mrs. Narracombe. 'You'm frettin' about somethin',' I says. 'No, Jim,' she says, 'I'm not frettin'.' 'Yes, you be,' I says. 'No,' she says, and her tears come rollin' down. 'You'm cryin', that's what then.' I says. She puts her hand over her heart. 'It hurts me,' she says, 'but 'twill soon be better,' she says. 'But if anything should happen to me, Jim, I wants to be buried under this here apple tree.' I laughed. 'What's goin' to happen to you?' I says. 'Don't be foolish.' 'No,' she says, 'I won't be foolish.' Well, I know what maids are, and I never thought no more about it, till 2 days later arter that, about 6 in the evenin', I was comin' up with the calves when I see somethin' dark lying in the stream, close to that big apple tree. I says to myself: 'Is that a pig? Funny place for a pig to get to.' And I goes up to it, and I see what it was." The old man stopped. His eyes, turned upward, had a bright, suffering look. "'Twas the maid in a little narrer pool there that's made by the stoppin' of a rock, where I see the young gentlemen bathin' once or twice. 'Er was lyin' on her face in the water. There was a plant, goldie cups growin' out of the stone just above her head. And when I come to look at her face, 'twas lovely, beautiful, so calm's a baby, wonderful, beautiful it was. When the doctor saw her, he said her couldn't a never done it in so little bit of water if her hadn't a been in an ecstasy. And judgin' from her face, there was just how she was. It made me cry, proper beautiful it was. 'Twas June then, but she'd a found a little bit of apple blossom left over somewhere, and stuck it in her hair. That's why I thinks her must a been in ecstasy to go on it gay like that. Why, there wasn't more than 1.5 foot of water. But I tell 'ee one thing, that's metered aren't. I knew it, and she knew it, and no one's persuade me as 'tesn't. I told 'em what she said to me about bein' buried under the apple tree, but I think that turned 'em, made it look too much as if she'd had it in her mind deliberate, and so they buried her up here. Parson we had then was very particular, he was." Again the old man drew his hand over the turf. "'Tes wonderful, it seems," he added slowly, "what maids'll do for love. She 'ad a lovin' 'art. I guess 'twas broken. But us never knew nothin'." He looked up as if for approval of his story, but Ashurst had walked past him as if he were not there. Up on the top of the hill, beyond where he had spread the lunch over, out of sight, he lay down on his face. So had his virtue been rewarded, and the Cyprian goddess of love taken her revenge. And before his eyes, dim with tears, came Megan's face with the sprig of apple blossom in her dark wet hair. "What did I do that was wrong?" he thought. "What did I do?" But he could not answer. Spring, with its rush of passion, its flowers and song, the spring in his heart and Megan's. Was it just love seeking a victim?
The Greek was right there, the words of Hippolytus as true to day: For mad is the heart of love, and gold in the gleam of his wing, And all to the spell thereof bend when he makes his spring; All life that is wild and young in mountain and wave and stream, All that of earth is sprung, or breathes in the red sunbeam; Yea, and mankind, o'er all royal throne, Cyprian, Cyprian, is thine alone. The Greek was right. Megan, poor little Megan, coming over the hill; Megan under the old apple tree, waiting and looking; Megan dead, with beauty printed on her. A voice said: "Oh, there you are! Look!" Ashurst rose, took his wife's sketch, and stared at it in silence. "Is the foreground right, Frank?" "Yes." "But there's something wanting, isn't there?" Ashurst nodded. "Wanting the apple tree, the singing, and the gold." And solemnly he put his lips to her forehead. It was his silver wedding day. End of Part VII. End of Tale number 3